there's a specific kind of quiet that settles over your life when you realize most of your friendships have faded, not dramatically, not with conflict or betrayal, just quietly, like watching fog roll in until you can't see the other side anymore. And what's strange is that you didn't fight it. You didn't panic. You didn't desperately reach out to pull people back. You just let it happen. And that acceptance, that willingness to let the circle shrink, tells you something about yourself that you're not sure how to name yet. You scroll through your contacts and notice how few names feel right to call. Not because those people are bad, not because you dislike them, because calling them would require a version of yourself you no longer have the energy to perform. That version who laughs at the right moments, who asks the expected questions, who fills silence before it becomes uncomfortable. That version still exists somewhere inside you, but accessing it feels like putting on clothes that no longer fit. Technically possible, but deeply uncomfortable. So instead, you sit with the quiet. And in that quiet, questions start to surface. Questions you've been avoiding because they don't have easy answers. Why does being around people feel more isolating than being alone? Why do you feel guilty for not wanting more friends when everyone says connection is essential? Why does the idea of a busy social calendar make your chest tighten instead of filling you with excitement? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're real. And they point to something about how you're built that doesn't match the template you've been given. You've heard the stories your whole life. People need people. Humans are social creatures. No man is an island. Those statements get repeated so often they start to sound like universal truths. But when you measure them against your actual experience, they don't quite fit. You don't feel starved for connection. You feel saturated, not with the connections you have, but with the energy it takes to maintain them. Every text message carries weight. Every invitation requires calculation. Every conversation leaves residue that takes hours to process. And here's what nobody tells you. That processing isn't optional. You can't just have a conversation and move on. Your mind replays it, analyzes it, notices what was said and what wasn't, picks up on the microshifts in tone that signal discomfort or dishonesty or distraction. You catch things that others miss entirely, and catching them means carrying them, which means that a 30-minute coffee with a friend doesn't end when you say goodbye. It continues for hours afterward as you sort through everything you absorbed. They see you declining invitations and assume you're antisocial. They notice you don't reach out often and think you don't care. They watch you slip away from group chats and friend circles and conclude you're depressed or stuck or somehow failing at the basic human task of maintaining relationships. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is that you're managing an internal reality they can't see. One where every interaction has a cost, and you've learned through painful trial and error that you have to budget that cost carefully. You didn't always know this about yourself. There was a time when you tried to keep up, when you said yes to everything, when you showed up even when you didn't want to, because that's what good friends do. And what you discovered is that forcing yourself to be socially available when you're internally depleted doesn't make you a better friend. It makes you resentful. It makes you perform instead of connect. It makes you feel like you're watching yourself from the outside, saying things you don't mean, laughing at things that aren't funny, pretending to be present when you're actually counting down the minutes until you can leave. That realization changed something. You started saying no more often. Started protecting your time and energy like the finite resources they are. Started choosing solitude over shallow company. And the world responded with concern. Are you okay? You seem distant. We never see you anymore. Those questions came wrapped in care, but underneath them was an assumption. The assumption that your withdrawal meant something was wrong with you, that healthy people naturally want to be surrounded by others, that choosing to be alone is a red flag. But you don't feel like something's wrong. You feel like something's finally right. like you've stopped trying to fit into a social structure that was never designed for the way you process the world. And that relief, that sense of finally being able to breathe, tells you more than any self-help article or well-meaning advice ever could. It tells you that what looks like isolation from the outside is actually alignment on the inside. Still, the doubt lingers, because even when you feel certain about your choices, you can't completely escape the voice that says, maybe you're just avoiding, maybe you're hiding, maybe you're using your sensitivity as an excuse to not do the hard work of maintaining relationships. That voice sounds reasonable. It sounds like wisdom. But when you really listen to it, you notice something. It's not your voice. It's the voice of every message you've ever received about what a good life is supposed to look like. And that life includes lots of friends, frequent socializing, constant connection. What that voice doesn't account for is that you've tried that life. You've lived in the center of social circles. You've been the one people called, the one who showed up, the one who held space for others. And what you learned is that being needed isn't the same as being understood. That being surrounded isn't the same as being seen. That you can be in a room full of people who like you and still feel completely alone because none of them are meeting you at the depth where you actually live. That depth is where the real difference lies. Most people touch the surface of their emotional experience and move on. They feel something, acknowledge it briefly, then shift their attention elsewhere. But you don't work that way. When you feel something, it doesn't just pass through you. It settles, it expands, it connects to other feelings, other memories, other patterns you've noticed over years of watching yourself and others. A single moment of tension in a conversation can unpack into hours of understanding about relationship dynamics, unspoken needs, and the gap between what people say and what they mean. This isn't overthinking, though it's often dismissed as such. It's processing. It's the way your system makes sense of emotional data that comes in at high volume and intensity. And because you process this way, casual friendships don't really work for you. They require you to stay on the surface where nothing you're actually experiencing can be shared. You end up talking about the weather, weekend plans, surface observations about life, while everything real stays locked inside because bringing it up would shift the tone in ways people aren't prepared for. You've tested this. You've tried being honest about what you're actually thinking or feeling in moments when the conversation allows for it. And what happens is predictable. People get uncomfortable, they change the subject. They offer quick fixes or reassurances that miss the point entirely. Or worse, they start seeing you as intense, heavy, too much. So you learn to edit yourself, to keep the real thoughts quiet, to participate in conversations that feel like play acting, because the alternative is making people uneasy. And here's what that creates over time. A growing sense that most friendships require you to be less than you are. Not because people are malicious, but because they're not equipped to meet you where you actually exist. They want the easy version, the light version, the version that doesn't require them to go deeper than they're comfortable going. You can be that version for a while, but eventually it starts to feel like slow suffocation, like you're spending all your time translating yourself into a language that loses everything important in translation. So you stop, not all at once. Gradually, you start letting texts go unanswered a little longer. You decline invitations with vague excuses. You stop initiating plans, and people notice, but they don't understand. They think you're pulling away from them, when really you're pulling toward yourself, toward the parts of you that get buried under the weight of constant performance, toward the quiet where you can finally hear your own thoughts without having to package them for external consumption. What's interesting is that when you create this space, when you stop forcing yourself into social situations that drain you, you discover something unexpected. You're not lonely. Loneliness is wanting connection and not having it. What you feel is more like solitude, chosen, protective, restorative solitude, the kind that lets you exist without explanation, without adjustment, without the constant low-level anxiety of wondering if you're being too much or not enough. In that solitude, you start noticing things about friendship itself. How much of it is built on proximity and convenience rather than genuine resonance? How many friendships persist simply because they always have, not because they're actively nourishing anyone involved? How often people stay connected out of obligation or habit or fear of being alone rather than authentic desire to know each other. Once you see these patterns, you can't unsee them. You start evaluating your relationships differently. You ask yourself harder questions. Does this person actually know me, or do they know the version I show them? Do I feel more myself after spending time with them or less? Is this connection adding something real to my life, or is it just filling space? And when you answer those questions honestly, the circle gets smaller, because most relationships, when examined closely, are based on shallow foundations. Shared history, mutual convenience, surface compatibility, not the kind of depth that makes vulnerability feel safe. This is where people misunderstand empaths completely. They assume that being empathic means wanting to be around people constantly, that being attuned to emotions would make you crave social connection. But the opposite is often true. Being empathic means you absorb emotional information, whether you want to or not. You pick up on what people are feeling beneath what they're saying. You sense the anxiety under the smile, the frustration beneath the polite agreement, the loneliness inside the crowd. And absorbing all of that is exhausting in ways that people who don't experience it can't comprehend. It's not that you don't care about people. You care intensely, sometimes too much. You feel their pain, their stress, their unspoken struggles as if they were your own. And that level of emotional porosity means that being around others isn't neutral. It's immersive. Every person you interact with leaves an imprint. Every environment you enter affects your internal state. So when you have fewer friends, it's not because you were cold or disconnected. It's because you're trying to maintain some boundary between yourself and the emotional noise of the world. People who don't experience this often give advice that makes no sense to you. Just put yourself out there, join clubs, say yes more often, go to events, as if the problem is lack of opportunity or effort. You've been to the events, you've joined the groups, you put yourself out there more times than you can count. And what you've learned is that quantity doesn't create quality. That being in rooms full of people doesn't guarantee finding anyone who speaks your language. That sometimes the loneliest you've ever felt was when you were surrounded by acquaintances who liked you but didn't know you. So you stop taking that advice. You stop pretending that the solution to having few friends is forcing yourself to collect more. Because what you actually want isn't more connections. It's different connections, ones where you don't have to dim your intensity, where silence doesn't need to be filled, where you can say what you're actually thinking without watching someone's face change from open to guarded. Those connections are rare enough that you might go years without finding one. And in those years, you have a choice. Fill your life with substitutes, with people who are nice enough but not quite right. Or protect the space for something real, even if that means being alone more often than society says is healthy. You've chosen the latter, not because you're afraid of connection, but because you've learned that the wrong connections are worse than none at all. That feeling misunderstood while surrounded is more painful than being understood by no one. That loneliness isn't about being alone. It's about being unseen. And you can be unseen in a crowded room just as easily as in an empty one. This is where the specific eights start to clarify themselves. The patterns that separate empaths with few friends from people who are simply introverted or shy or going through a rough patch. Because what you're experiencing isn't temporary. It's not something you'll grow out of or fix with the right therapist or overcome by pushing yourself harder. It's fundamental to how you're configured. And once you understand that, everything shifts. The first trait is this: you don't experience other people's emotions as information. You experience them as immersion. When someone near you is anxious, you don't just notice their anxiety. You feel it in your body. Your chest tightens. Your thoughts start racing. Your nervous system responds as if the anxiety is yours. This is an empathy in the casual sense, where you understand what someone is going through. This is empathy as a sensory experience. You're literally feeling what they're feeling, often before they've said a word about it. This happens automatically. You can't turn it off. Someone walks into a room carrying stress, and you feel the air change. A friend texts you, and you can sense their emotional state through the pacing of their words, the choice of punctuation, the things they don't say. You sit in a meeting and absorb the undercurrents of tension, competition, insecurity, flowing between people who think they're hiding it well. All of that emotional data comes flooding in, whether you consent to it or not. Most people filter this information unconsciously. They might sense something off, but then dismiss it and move on. You can't do that. The information sticks. It demands processing. So after any social interaction, you need time to discharge what you've absorbed, to separate what's yours from what's theirs, to come back to baseline. And that recovery time isn't optional. If you don't take it, the emotional residue AK accumulates until you feel completely overwhelmed by feelings that aren't even yours to begin with. This is why having many friends becomes unsustainable. Each friendship represents another source of emotional input, another person whose feelings you'll absorb, another relationship that requires you to manage not just your own internal state, but theirs as well. It's not that you don't want to be there for people. It's that being there for people costs you in ways they'll never understand because they're not wired the same way. So you limit the number of people who have access to you, not because you're selfish, because you're trying to survive. The second trait builds on the first. You can't do shallow. Your system doesn't have a setting for surface level interaction. When you're with someone, you're all in. You're reading their body language, tracking their emotional shifts, noticing inconsistencies between their words and their energy, holding space for what's unspoken. You're not doing this consciously. It's happening automatically in the background of every interaction, which means that what other people experience as casual hangouts, you experience as intensive emotional labor. Coffee with a friend isn't just coffee. It's managing the conversation flow, sensing when they need you to ask questions versus when they need you to share, noticing when the topic shifts into territory that makes them uncomfortable, adjusting your energy to match what the moment requires. You do this instinctively because you can't not do it, and it's exhausting. So when people suggest you just relax and have fun and stop overthinking things, they're asking you to do something that's fundamentally not possible given how your awareness works. This is why you prefer deep friendships over broad social networks. If you're going to expend that much energy on a relationship, it needs to give something back. It needs to be mutual. It needs to be someone who's willing to go to the depths with you rather than keeping everything light and comfortable. And those people are incredibly rare. Most people don't want to go deep. They want easy. They want fun. They want relationships that don't require them to look at themselves too closely or feel things too intensely. So you end up with very few people who can actually meet you where you live. The third trait is subtler, but just as significant. You have an unusually high sensitivity to inauthenticity. You can feel when someone is performing rather than being real, when they're saying what they think they should say instead of what they actually think, when they're managing their image instead of showing up as themselves. That sensitivity makes most social environments feel like navigating a minefield because most people are performing most of the time. They're not being deliberately fake. They're just doing what social conditioning has taught them to do, managing impressions, staying safe, keeping things smooth. But you can't relax into that. When you sense performance, your system goes on alert. not because you judge it, but because your nervous system recognizes that you're not getting the truth. You're getting a version, a curated presentation, and something in you can't fully trust or connect with the presentation. You need the real person underneath, the one who doesn't have all the answers, who's uncertain and conflicted and messy, who shows up without a script. And when you can't find that person, when all you're getting is the polished version, you feel alone even when you're surrounded. It creates a strange paradox. You're often the person people open up to. They tell you things they don't tell others. They feel safe being vulnerable in your presence because you create space for it. You don't judge. You don't fix. You just witness. And that's healing for them. But the relationship rarely goes both ways, because when you try to be equally vulnerable, when you share the depth of what you actually think and feel, people get overwhelmed. They weren't prepared for that level of intensity. They wanted to be heard, not to hear something that challenges them or requires them to sit with discomfort. So you end up being everyone's therapist, but no one's friend. People come to you when they're struggling. They value your insight, your ability to see what they can't see, your willingness to go into the hard conversations without flinching. But they don't want that all the time. They don't want to live at that depth. So they take what they need and then retreat back to lighter relationships. And you're left holding the emotional weight of their struggles without anyone holding yours, which is why over time you stop offering that depth to people who can't reciprocate. You save it for yourself or for the rare person who can actually match it. The fourth trait explains why you're comfortable being alone in ways most people aren't. You have a rich internal world, not just thoughts and feelings, but entire landscapes of reflection, imagination, analysis, creativity. You can spend hours inside your own mind without getting bored because there's always something to explore, a memory to examine from a new angle, a pattern to trace across different areas of your life, a question to sit with until it unfolds into understanding. Your mind is an empty space that needs to be filled with external stimulation. It's more like a forest, dense, layered, full of hidden paths. This means that solitude doesn't feel like deprivation. It feels like coming home. When you're alone, you can finally hear yourself. You can follow your thoughts wherever they lead without having to explain or justify or make them palatable for someone else. You can feel your feelings fully without managing how they're landing on another person. You can exist without translation, and that's not loneliness. That's freedom. The freedom to be as complex and contradictory and intense as you actually are without worrying about whether someone else can handle it. People who don't have this kind of internal richness can't understand why you choose to be alone. For them, being alone means being cut off from stimulation, entertainment, connection. It means boredom or loneliness or missing out. But you're not missing anything. You're gaining access to parts of yourself that only emerge in silence. The subtle thoughts, the quiet knowing, the creative impulses that get drowned out by social noise. You need that access the way other people need social connection. It's not optional. It's essential to your well-being. The fifth trait is perhaps the most misunderstood. You have a finely tuned radar for emotional labor imbalance. You can sense immediately when a relationship is one-sided, when you're giving more than you're receiving, when someone wants your energy, your attention, your emotional support, but isn't prepared to offer the same in return. And unlike people who might tolerate these imbalances for months or years, you withdraw quickly, not out of bitterness, out of preservation. You've learned what happens when you ignore this radar. You've stayed in friendships where you were always the listener, never the heard, where you showed up consistently, but others only appeared when they needed something, where your depth was welcomed, but their surface was all they offered back. And what you discovered is that those relationships don't just fail to nourish you, they actively deplete you. They create a deficit that takes weeks to recover from. So now, when you sense that imbalance forming, you step back before resentment has a chance to build. This makes you seem cold to people who don't understand. They think friendship should be unconditional, that you should give without keeping score, that if you really cared, you wouldn't notice or mind the imbalance. But that perspective comes from people who don't give the way you give, who don't feel the cost the way you feel it. For them, friendship is casual exchange. For you, it's full immersion. So yes, you notice when it's one-sided. And yes, you protect yourself by withdrawing, because the alternative is giving until there's nothing left of you. What's interesting is that this doesn't mean you're transactional. You're not calculating who owes what or keeping a mental ledger of favors. It's more intuitive than that. You can feel when a relationship has reciprocity and when it doesn't. When there's genuine mutual investment versus when someone is taking your presence for granted. And that feeling guides your decisions about where to invest your limited energy. You'd rather have one friend who sees you and meets you equally than 10 who only call when they need something. The sixth trait connects to something most people never consciously acknowledge. You don't bond through shared activities. You bond through shared reality. What this means is that doing things together, having fun, making memories, all the stuff that creates friendship for most people doesn't create the same bond for you. You can go to events, travel together, share experiences, and still feel completely disconnected if there's no emotional or intellectual resonance underneath. What you need is someone who perceives the world similarly, who notices the same subtle dynamics you notice, who asks the same uncomfortable questions, who isn't afraid to acknowledge the complexity and contradiction in everything. You need someone who can sit with you in the gray, the areas where most people rush to find certainty. Someone who understands that the deepest truths are often the ones that don't resolve neatly. And those people are almost impossible to find because most humans are hardwired to seek comfort, simplicity, clear answers. So you go through life meeting people who are perfectly nice, perfectly functional, perfectly capable of being good friends to others, but they're not right for you. Because right for you means being willing to question everything, to look at the parts of life most people avoid, to feel deeply instead of skimming surfaces. And most people aren't interested in that. They're interested in enjoying life, not examining it, which leaves you in the strange position of being surrounded by potential friends, but feeling like you're speaking a different language than all of them. The seventh trait is one you probably noticed early but didn't have words for until much later. You carry other people's emotional states long after interactions end. A tense conversation doesn't just affect you in the moment. It follows you home. It occupies your thoughts while you're trying to sleep. It replays in your body for days, not because you're ruminating, though it might look like that from the outside, because your nervous system is still processing the emotional charge that got activated. This is different from memory. Everyone remembers conversations, but you don't just remember, you re-experience the anxiety you felt when your friend was upset, the tension from a disagreement that never got fully resolved, the sadness you absorbed when someone shared something painful. All of that stays in your system until it's been fully metabolized. And metabolizing emotions takes time and solitude. It requires space where you're not taking in new emotional input while you're still processing the old. This is another reason why constant socializing doesn't work for you. You need recovery time between interactions. You need to discharge what you've absorbed before taking on more. But in a world that values constant connection, constant availability, constant engagement, asking for that recovery time makes you seem distant or uncommitted. People want immediate responses. They want frequent contact. They want you to always be accessible. And you simply can't give that without completely overwhelming your system. So you create boundaries that other people find excessive. You don't respond to text right away. You need days or weeks between social engagements. You decline spontaneous plans because you haven't recovered from the last interaction yet. And people interpret this as disinterest when it's actually self-care, when it's the only way you know to maintain your equilibrium in a world that's constantly demanding more than you can sustainably give. The eighth trait is the one that probably causes you the most internal conflict. You're deeply principled about authenticity, yet you've learned that being fully authentic costs you relationships. You value honesty, depth, realness. You want to show up as yourself without filtering or performing. But you've discovered through painful experience that most people can't handle that. They say they want authenticity, but what they actually want is authenticity within comfortable limits. They want you to be real as long as real doesn't make them uncomfortable. So you face an impossible choice. Be yourself and lose people, or adjust yourself and lose yourself. And increasingly, you're choosing the former. You're choosing to be alone rather than be diluted, to have no friends rather than friends who only know a curated version of you. And that choice comes with grief, because part of you still wants to be accepted as you are. Part of you still hopes you'll find people who can meet your intensity without flinching. But another part of you has accepted that those people might not exist in the numbers you need them to. This acceptance is where something shifts. You stop seeing your solitude as a problem to be fixed. You start seeing it as a reflection of your standards, of your unwillingness to compromise on what connection should feel like, of your commitment to depth over breadth, quality over quantity, truth over comfort. And while that doesn't erase the loneliness completely, it transforms it into something more bearable, something that feels chosen rather than inflicted. The final trait is perhaps the most defining one. You measure your well-being not by how many people you're connected to, but by how intact you feel. Most people gauge their social health by external metrics: number of friends, frequency of contact, invitations received, social calendar fullness. But you've learned those metrics are meaningless if achieving them requires fragmenting yourself, if staying connected means abandoning your truth, ignoring your needs, overriding your limits, then connection isn't actually serving you. So you've developed a different metric. After an interaction, do you feel more like yourself or less? After time with someone, are you energized or depleted? Does this relationship allow you to expand, or does it require you to contract? And you use those questions to guide your choices about who stays in your life and who gradually fades out. It's not personal. It's not about them being bad people. It's about whether the relationship supports your integrity or compromises it. This is why you can have few friends and still feel fundamentally okay, because the friends you do have, or the solitude you've chosen instead, allows you to remain whole. And wholeness matters more to you than belonging. Integration matters more than inclusion. I'm known by one person matters more than being liked by many. These aren't the values society taught you, but they're the values you've discovered through living in your particular sensitivity, your particular depth, your particular way of being in the world. And if you're reading this now and feeling that strange mix of relief and sadness, of being seen and being alone and being seen, then you know exactly what this is. You know that having few or no friends as an empath isn't a failure. It's not something you need to fix or overcome. It's a natural consequence of living with a nervous system that experiences connection at an intensity most people never touch. And the question isn't how to change that. The question is whether you're willing to honor it, to build a life that works with your design instead of against it, to stop apologizing for needing what you need, to accept that your path looks different and that different doesn't mean wrong.